The Seven Wonders of the Ancient World by Edgar J. Banks. The Temple of Diana.
Please like this video so that more people have access to this content. Enjoy and also follow this channel to see other videos about art.
The Temple of Diana. The Greeks used to say that Artemis was the daughter of Zeus and Leto, and the twin sister of Apollo, that she was born on the 6th day of the month in a grove in Ortygia, that she was the goddess of the chase, and so they represented her with a bow and arrows and with an animal at her side. The Romans called her Diana. To them she was the goddess of childbirth, and the mothers of the newly born babes used to offer their clothing to her. In later ages she was pictured as seated on the crescent moon. Some called her Artemis Brauronia. They thought that she appeared to men only in the form of a bear roaming wild about the fields. Primitive man has always believed that some of the animals are superhuman. That is why the ancient Egyptians used to keep a sacred bull in the temple, or the Romans watched the flights of birds, or the American Indian has his snake dance. When the bear goddess was displeased or hungry, she attacked men and killed them. To appease her wrath, a human sacrifice was offered to her, and with the sacrifice she was pleased, for her hunger was satisfied. At the sacrificial ceremony, little girls, dressed in bear skins, used to dance about the bear, and then one of them was given to the beast. Once there was a man who had a goat, and he called the goat his daughter. When it came time to sacrifice another girl to the bear goddess, he offered the goat daughter in her place. The bear goddess seemed satisfied, and so human sacrifices ceased. An image of a bear made to represent the goddess has been found upon the Acropolis at Athens. Some say that the gods we worship are only the creation of our own minds. They are born with us, and they develop as we develop. They possess the forms and the characteristics which we think our gods should possess. Perhaps the goddess Artemis was at first a bear, and when in time she assumed the human form, she became the goddess of the chase, or of agriculture, or of sailors, or of childbirth, or of the moon. So Artemis, or Diana, had many births and many names and many different duties to perform in the many lands where she was worshipped. There were some who said that in very early days a wooden statue of a goddess fell from heaven into a thicket, and that vines twining about it held it upright, that men found the goddess standing in the thicket and began to worship her. Some say that the goddess was Artemis, and that the place where she fell was in Greece. Others say that she was Cybele, the Asiatic mother goddess of the earth, who was worshipped especially by the female warriors, the Amazons. The place where she fell was near the coast of Asia Minor, where the river Cayster empties into the sea. Her statue, so later pictures of it inform us, was of wood. Upon the head was a mural headdress to represent the wall of a city. The upper part of the body was entirely covered with breasts, for she was the mother of all the earth. The lower part of her body terminated with a pillar, all carved with the figures of animals, or perhaps wrapped about with an embroidered cloth. The thicket where the statue fell was transformed to a grove. In the grove was an aged cedar tree, perhaps more venerated than the others about it, and in its great hollow trunk the statue was placed. The hollow cedar tree was the first temple of the goddess. Not far from the grove where the sacred temple tree used to stand was a little valley lying between the hills Prion and Croesus. Tradition tells us that long before the days of Homer, a migrating band of Amazons settled in the valley. Perhaps those women warriors built a city there, and were later driven away by the Carians and Pelasgians. About 1100 B.C., Androclus, son of Codrus, king of Athens, arrived in the valley with a party of Greeks from Ionia, and then begins the story of the Greek city of Ephesus. The story is long and eventful, for the city, lying by a good harbour at the entrance to Asia Minor, became the centre of trade and wealth and culture, and more than that, it was the great religious centre of all the Orient. The religious history of the city may have begun with the Amazons who worshipped the Oriental Cybele, for when the Greeks came to Ephesus, she was the local goddess of the place. They seem to have associated her or confused her with their own Artemis or Diana, and so the great Diana of Ephesus was the composite offspring of both Greek and Oriental deities. How long the goddess was contented to live in the hollow cedar tree, history does not tell us. Perhaps the old tree was blown down by the wind. Or perhaps, as the fame of the goddess increased, she desired a more stately residence, for in the 8th century B.C. a platform of greenish stone was built about the place where the tree had stood, and upon the platform her statue and an altar were placed. A stone wall was then built about the platform, but the goddess still stood beneath the open sky. This was her second temple, but her first one of stone, and to it the worshippers brought gifts of metal and ivory and bone and crystal and paste and glass and clay. Some of these early gifts to the goddess are now carefully preserved in the British Museum. The fame of the goddess spread, for she seemed to bring prosperity to all who worshipped her. By the year 650, she had outgrown her little shrine, and it was enlarged and placed at a higher level. But her statue continued to stand in the very same place. This was her third temple. Diana had scarcely entered her new abode when it happened that hordes of the wild Cimmerians overran the country and burned the temple. Yet they spared Ephesus. The people said that Diana had saved the city, and therefore at once a fourth temple, larger and on a higher foundation, was built to the protecting goddess. It was of a Greek type, surrounded with columns, but we know little of its details. Chersiphon and his son Metagenes of Knossos were its architects. The increasing fame of the goddess brought larger and larger numbers of pilgrims from afar to worship at her shrine, and they carried back to their homes wonderful tales of her power. Her gifts increased, and even the new temple was scarcely large enough to contain them. A still greater temple was required, and it was decided that all the people should have a part in building it. From 560 to 546, Croesus, the wealthiest man of the ancient world, was the king of Lydia, and Ephesus, then a mighty city, fell into his hands. Croesus had been told that his riches and power were so great that they might arouse even the jealousy of the gods, and to prevent such a calamity he contributed liberally to the building fund of the new temple. History does not tell us the amount of his gift, but it was so large that he was regarded as its builder. Thus, the fifth temple of Diana came into existence. It stood in the same place where all of the earlier temples had stood, but at a higher level. It was so large that its cella alone covered all the space which they had occupied, yet the statue still marked the place where the old cedar tree had stood. Paeonius of Ephesus and Demetrius, a priest of the temple, were its architects. Its stone was the white marble from the hills 7 miles away. Its main foundation was 360 feet in length and 180 in width. Its entire ground plan covered an area of 80,000 square feet. Its more than 100 marble columns surrounding the cella in double rows were of the best Ionic order, but we do not know their height. Its walls bore sculptures by the best artists. We are told that 120 years passed before it was completed. But at last, some time between 430 and 420 B.C., it was dedicated. Then there was rejoicing in Ephesus. People from all the world gathered to witness the games and to hear the orators and the poets. Timotheus won the prize for his lyric ode. The smoke from the temple altar now rose in greater volume than ever. Gifts came in far greater abundance, and Diana was acknowledged to be the chief goddess of all the world. A story is told that in the year 395 an attempt was made to burn the temple. Perhaps it was partly burned and restored again. However, later there lived at Ephesus a Greek named Herostratus, who desired to perform some deed which would cause his name to be handed down through all the ages. And so on a night in October 356, the very night when Alexander the Great was born, he burned the temple to the ground. Herostratus won the eternal fame he coveted, but he is known only for this one act, the greatest crime of which he could conceive. According to Hegesias, a Greek writer of about 300, Herostratus chose a convenient time for burning the temple. That night the goddess Diana was absent. She had gone to Macedonia to assist at the birth of Alexander. The crime of Herostratus was so enormous that his name was erased from the public records. Yet indirectly it resulted in great good to the goddess, to the city, and to all the world. A new temple arose, larger, loftier, richer, more magnificent. It was the great Temple of Diana, which was the wonder of the world. Work on the new temple was begun about the year 350. And though Pliny says that 120 years were required for its construction, it seems to have been completed in a third of that time. In 334, when Alexander came to Ephesus, he offered to defray the cost of its completion, if he might be permitted to dedicate it in his own name to the goddess. The Ephesians, unwilling that such great honour should be given to the Macedonian, and yet fearing to displease him, replied, "It is not fitting that one god should build a temple to another god." Though the aid of Alexander was refused, Dinocrates, his favourite architect, who planned the city of Alexandria, supervised its construction. Pliny, however, says that Chersiphron was the architect. The new temple stood on the site of all the others. Its foundation, enlarged to 418 feet in length and 239 in width, was built up with great blocks of stone 7 feet above the older temples, and 10 stone steps led to its surface. Upon the foundation was the temple platform 9½ feet higher. It was reached by 14 steps. The temple itself was 342 feet long and 164 feet in width. 127 great stone columns, 6 feet in diameter at the base and more than 60 feet tall, supported the roof. The columns were about 17 feet apart, and a row of 8 of them extended along the front. 36 of the columns, some square and others round, were donated by the kings of different countries, and were sculptured in relief from the base to the height of 20 feet. Above the sculptures they were fluted. The great cella was partly open to the sky, and the roof about the opening was covered with large white marble tiles. The friezes were sculptured by the greatest artists, but unfortunately we know little of them. Before the temple entrance stood the great image of the goddess, probably a large reproduction of the wooden statue which long before fell from heaven. Such was the outer appearance of the temple. In most respects it resembled the Greek temples of that age. It was not alone its size, nor its sculptured decorations, which gave it a place among the seven wonders. The elaborate service, the wealth, the varied business interests it controlled, the wide influence it exerted, all united in adding to its fame. Though several of the ancient writers have written of the temple, Pliny, who saw it only after it had been standing 400 years, has given us one of the fullest accounts. He says: "The most wonderful monument of Grecian influence, and one that merits our genuine admiration, is the Temple of the Diana of Ephesus, which took 120 years in building, a work in which all Asia joined. A marshy soil was selected for its site, in order that it might not suffer from earthquakes, or the chasms which they produce. On the other hand, again, that the foundations of so vast a pile might not have to rest upon a loose and shifting bed, layers of trodden charcoal were placed beneath, with fleeces covered with wool upon the top of them. The entire length of the temple is 425 feet, and the breadth 225. The columns are 127 in number, and 60 feet in height, each of them presented by different kings. 36 of these columns are carved, and one of them by the hands of Scopas. Chersiphron was the architect who presided over the work. The great marvel of this building is, how such ponderous architraves could possibly have been raised to so great a height. This, however, the architect effected by means of bags filled with sand, which he piled up upon an inclined plane until they reached beyond the capitals of the columns. Then, as he gradually emptied the lower bags, the architraves insensibly settled in the places assigned them. But the greatest difficulty of all was found in laying the lintel, which he placed over the entrance doors. It was an enormous mass of stone, and by no possibility could it be brought to lie level upon the jambs which formed its bed, in consequence of which the architect was driven to such a state of anxiety and desperation as to commit suicide. Wearied and quite worn out with such thoughts as these, during the night, they say, he beheld in a dream the goddess in honour of whom the temple was being erected, who exhorted him to live on, for that she herself had placed the stone in its proper position. And such, in fact, next morning was found to be the case, the stone apparently having come to the proper level by dint of its own weight. The other decorations of this work would suffice to fill many volumes, but they do not tend in any way to illustrate the works of nature. Diana of Ephesus, as we have seen, was partly Asiatic and partly European in origin. Her temple service was Asiatic rather than Greek. Neither the priests nor the priestesses were permitted to marry. At the head of the temple staff was an official who bore the Persian title of Megabyzus. The Greeks called him the Neocorus. Just how he attained his office we do not know, but probably he was appointed by the state. A little ivory statue found in the ruins of the temple a few years ago is supposed to represent him. The priests were graded according to the services they rendered. It was the duty of the theologi to give instruction in the religious rites and sacred legends. The hymnodi composed the temple songs and conducted the musical ceremonies. Responsive hymns always formed a prominent part in the temple ritual, and during the processions when the statues of the goddess were taken about the city, the marching was accompanied with weird chants. The heroi, who must have been by far the largest class of the priests, performed the manual work about the temple. As the goddess Diana was connected, at least in legend, with the Amazons, priestesses naturally played a prominent part in her worship. They were known as the Parthenoi, or the unwedded, or more popularly as the Melissae, or bees, perhaps because of their great activity in the temple service. That is perhaps why the form of a bee is stamped upon the coins of the city. They also were divided into classes, but it is impossible to say just what their duties were. Indirectly connected with the temple staff was a host of silversmiths, who manufactured small images of the temple and of the goddess, sometimes of silver, but more frequently of clay, to sell to the visiting pilgrims. The pilgrims purchased them to present as votive offerings to the goddess, or sometimes to take as souvenirs to their distant homes. Thus a part of the temple income was derived. The temple ceremonies were also Oriental in their character. The best of the offerings of animals and grains and fruits, as in the temples of old Babylonia, were consumed by the priests rather than burned upon the altar to the goddess. As in old Babylonia, too, once each year the statues of the goddess were taken about the city. The procession took place on the 25th of May, the day when the statue of the goddess is said to have fallen from heaven. There were hosts of statues, great and small, of wood and clay and stone and silver and gold. We are told of one man, Caius Vibius Salutaris, who presented the temple with many images of gold and silver, weighing several pounds each, and with money equivalent to $4,000 invested at 9% interest. The income of this endowment, which amounted to $360 a year, a very large sum for those days, was intended for the care of the images and for their transportation in the procession. The temple stood some over a mile from the city, but connected with it by a great highway 35 feet in width, and paved with marble blocks. Damianus, a wealthy Roman, built over this Via Sacra an arched stone stoa to protect the priests and the statues from the rain and the sun. The procession, with long lines of priests marching to the accompaniment of the weird music, and perhaps with the dancing priestesses, and with chariots laden with the statues, entered the city by the Magnesian Gate. Before the great theatre it halted. The images were carried to the stage, where the audience, which might have numbered more than 50,000, could see them. When the ceremonies, whatever they were completed, the procession passed through the principal streets and out by the Coressian Gate and back to the temple. Pilgrims flocked to Ephesus from all parts of the world, from Europe and Asia and Africa, vying with each other in the costliness of their gifts. There were treasures of gold and silver and ivory and rich embroideries. Sculptors and artists devoted their best works to the goddess, and among the objects most highly treasured were the statues of the Amazons, which Phidias made in competition with other artists, and a painting of Alexander by Apelles. In time the temple became a great museum, perhaps the first great museum in the world's history. Naturally, the usual and the more acceptable gifts were of money, and the wealth of the temple became prodigious. To care for the money and to invest it properly, there were expert financiers in the priesthood. Vast business enterprises were carried on. Large tracts of land were purchased and cultivated. Mines were developed, estates were administered, fisheries were controlled. The temple ships traded with all the world. The temple loaned money to those who required it, or borrowed it from those who had it to loan, and deposited for safe keeping treasures of every kind. At one time the temple controlled the greater part of the wealth of the Orient. It was to the ancient world all that the Bank of England is to the modern world, and more. The temple was also an asylum, a place of refuge for the fugitive or the criminal. Perhaps in the early times the right of asylum was confined to the temple itself, and most temples were and are still places of refuge. Later the boundaries of the asylum were extended. When the great Mithridates possessed the city, he sought popularity by enlarging them to the distance of a bow shot from the temple. Still later, when Mark Antony extended them to include a part of the city more than a mile away, the city became a haunt for criminals of all sorts. Augustus confined the sacred space to within a quarter of a mile of the temple, and surrounded it with a wall, traces of which may still be seen. Strabo speaks of the asylum in the following words: "The temple has the right of sanctuary to the present day, but the boundaries of the sanctuary have varied at different times. Alexander extended them to a stadium (600 feet). Mithridates shot an arrow from the roof, and is said to have shot it a little beyond a stadium. Antony doubled the distance, and thus included within the right of sanctuary a certain portion of the city. But this ordinance put the city at the mercy of the malefactors, so that Caesar Augustus cancelled it." During all the centuries that the temple stood, Asia Minor was the scene of many wars. Kings of the neighbouring states fought for it, won it, and lost it again. Its cities were frequently destroyed, and their people massacred, but Ephesus and the temple almost alone escaped. It was the belief among the common people that Diana protected the city, and that may well be true, for she was revered even by the enemies of the state. When the wealthy Croesus was besieging Ephesus and the city seemed about to fall, the priests stretched a rope from the temple about it to indicate that it was sacred ground. Croesus abandoned the siege and became a faithful follower of the goddess. Ephesus next fell to the kings of Persia, and though Xerxes destroyed other shrines, he showed great honour to Diana by leaving his own children in her charge for safety. With the defeat of the Persians, Ephesus became tributary to Athens, and then again it was Persian. Alexander was the next to possess it. Lysimachus built its great walls, and changed its name to Arsinoe in honour of his wife. Eumenes, king of Pergamum, restored its old name. Attalus took it next, and then his descendant, Attalus III, bequeathed it to Rome. Under the Romans, Ephesus was the chief city of the Roman province of Asia, and the richest in all the empire. Once, during the time of Mithridates, when the city revolted from Rome, its Roman citizens, even those that had taken refuge in the temple, were massacred. Sulla won the city back to Rome and punished it for unfaithfulness. Antony once besieged it, and with the beautiful Cleopatra lived there in great luxury. In spite of wars and changes in government, Ephesus flourished. The temple steadily grew in wealth and in influence. Christianity came to the world, and in 57 A.D. St. Paul, on one of his missionary journeys, came there. He was a brave man to attack the goddess in her own home, and as eloquent as brave, for the people listened eagerly to him. The pilgrims who had come from afar to worship the goddess were drawn to the new religion, and instead of spending their money for the little shrines of the temple, they returned home, taking the new religion with them. The story is told in the biblical book of the Acts, chapter 19. "And it came to pass that Paul came to Ephesus, and he went into the synagogue and spake boldly for the space of 3 months, disputing and persuading the things concerning the kingdom of God. And many that believed came and confessed and shewed their deeds. Many of them also which used curious arts brought their books together and burned them before all men. And they counted the price of them, and found it 50,000 pieces of silver. And the same time there arose no small stir about that way. For a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith, which made silver shrines for Diana, brought no small gain unto the craftsmen. Whom he called together with the workmen of like occupation, and said, Sirs, ye know that by this craft we have our wealth. Moreover, ye see and hear that not alone at Ephesus, but almost throughout all Asia, this Paul hath persuaded and turned away much people, saying that they be no gods, which are made with hands, so that not only that this our craft is in danger to be set at naught, but also that the temple of the great goddess Diana should be despised, and her magnificence should be destroyed, whom all Asia and the world worshippeth. And when they heard these things, they were full of wrath, and cried out, saying, Great is Diana of the Ephesians. and the whole city was filled with confusion, and having caught Gaius and Aristarchus, men of Macedonia, Paul's companions in travel, they rushed with one accord into the theatre. And when the town clerk had appeased the people, he said, Ye men of Ephesus, what man is there that knoweth not how that the city of the Ephesians is a worshipper of the great goddess Diana, and of the image which fell down from Jupiter? Seeing then that these things cannot be spoken against, ye ought to be quiet, and to do nothing rashly. For ye have brought hither these men, which are neither robbers of churches, nor yet blasphemers of your goddess. For we are in danger to be called in question for this day's uproar, there being no cause whereby we may give an account of this concourse. As far as we know, this was the first serious attack upon Diana, and St. Paul was so successful that he established a Christian church at Ephesus. For a time the Christians were imprisoned and martyred, yet Christianity spread. The trade of the silversmiths began to fall away. The old books of sorcery were burned. The very existence of Diana was threatened, and yet the struggle between Christianity and paganism continued for more than 2 centuries. In 262 A.D., the invading Goths destroyed the city and burned the temple. It was another severe blow to Diana. A smaller temple, which was built on the old site, was destroyed by the zealous Christians, and the followers of the goddess were persecuted. Finally, the Roman emperor commanded that all pagan temples be closed. The goddess Diana, who had ruled supreme for 1,500 years, was dead, and few were left to mourn her. Slowly the little that was left of Ephesus fell to ruins. The stones of the temple and of the fallen public buildings were used in the construction of another Christian church, whose ruins on the hill near where the temple had stood may still be seen. A tradition, though probably it is not true, says that some of the great columns supporting the dome of St. Sophia in Constantinople were taken from the temple. The deserted harbour of the city was soon choked up, and where the ships from all the world used to anchor, the bulrushes grew. The river, overflowing its banks, transformed the temple site into a malarial swamp. In the 11th century, the ruined city was a haunt for the Greek pirates who plied their trade along the coast. 2 centuries later, when the Turks came, a prosperous town was built near the site of the buried temple, and the Christian church, already ancient, was in its turn a quarry for the building material of an imposing mosque. In 1365, when the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem took Ephesus, it again became Christian, but in 1402 Tamerlane restored it to the Turks, in whose hands it has remained till this day. The ruins have now long been overgrown with shrubbery, and their only inhabitants are a few miserable peasants who live by catching the grey mullet in the old harbour, or by raising tobacco on the few fertile spots. Everywhere there is a confusion of ruins, but the site of the temple was long ago completely forgotten, and as one writer has said, of all the great temples of antiquity, the Artemisium, or Temple of Diana, was the only one whose site has disappeared without a trace. If you would visit the ruins of Ephesus, from Smyrna you would travel by the Aden Railroad to the south to the little village of Ayasaluk. The name of the village, a corruption of the Greek meaning the Holy Word of God, recalls the days when St. Paul established Christianity there. It is a small, squalid place where idle Turks loiter about the coffee house, and the storks roam unmolested along the street. The great columns of an ancient aqueduct, now overgrown with vines, tower above the little huts. The ruins of the old church on the hill have nearly disappeared, and the great mosque, the stones of whose walls were originally from the temple and then from the church, has long been an imposing ruin. A mile from the village is the great Magnesian Gate, and beyond it, in the valley between the hills, are ruins and shrubbery and waste and silence everywhere. In the year 1863, Mr. J. T. Wood, representing the British Museum, obtained permission from the Turkish government to search for the lost Temple of Diana. There were ruins in abundance, city gates and marble streets and theatres and churches and baths, but not a trace of the temple. For 6 long years he searched. Finally there appeared an inscription on the theatre wall, saying that the sacred processions came from the temple to the city by the Magnesian Gate and returned by the Coressian Gate. He identified the gates, and from the Magnesian Gate he followed the marble paving of the Sacred Way, now buried deep beneath the fields. It led him to a swamp by the old mosque, and there, on December 29th, 1869, 20 feet beneath the surface of the swamp, he found all that was left of the temple. Only its foundation and a few scattered sculptured stones and inscriptions remained. The work of excavation was continued till 1874, when the funds were exhausted. For 15 years, from 1894, the Austrian Archaeological Society conducted excavations in the city with valuable results. In the marble paving blocks of the streets were the deep ruts worn by the chariot wheels. Pedestals for statues line the Sacred Way, the great agora with its surrounding colonnade, the baths of Constantine, which earlier travellers had mistaken for the ruins of the temple, the so-called prison of St. Paul and tomb of St. Luke, and a score of wonderful marble buildings, all told of the glory and the might of the great Diana. Of more importance to our story were the excavations by Hogarth of the British Museum. For 6 months during the year 1904 he laboured at the old temple site. Down beneath the foundation of the temple which Wood had discovered, he found foundation stones of the Croesus temple, and beneath them were traces of 3 smaller temples of still earlier days. Thus the ruins repeat the long-lost story of the temple, which, because it was great and beautiful and rich, because it was a place of refuge, a museum, a bank, because it was revered more widely than any other, was the wonder of the world.
We hope you enjoyed this video. Please let us know in the comments what other art contents you would like to see. And don't forget to like this video and follow our channel. Thank you, and until the next video.